Alright, I think we're good to go. So, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Uh, I'll start because it's my point isn't. I don't know. I think it's like not as simple as just saying open borders. I think you've got to delineate between the two types of people that cross borders. There's visitors. There's people who are essentially just using access right to get to somewhere that they have some form of property right. And there's also immigrants or like settlers and they're much more. That's more of a statist concept fundamentally. Because in a purely free society, everyone would be a traveller.
Hmm. So, would your argument be that, say, I want to immigrate to the US, that the US would have some sort of right to stop me from immigrating there?
Well, it completely depends, because I think under the right set of circumstances, that could just be a purely private decision of some private individual to either rent an apartment to you or sell one to you, like that, and the right of somebody to employ you or not employ you. But when the government holds any form of, well, yeah, I'm just going to go straight for it and just say public property, but I'll come back to why that's a misunderstanding. Then yeah, that complicates the picture.
Okay, so why does the government like holding some sort of public possession? Why does that change what's going on? Hold on, I've not got any viewers. I think I'm unlisted.
Oh.
Oh, I'm public. Who knows? I guess I'll see afterwards if it's working.
No worries. Yeah, so I mean, if the government is holding any property, I mean, it's in square quotes, public property. I know it doesn't exist, but if they are holding property like that, and they're essentially giving property rights to immigrants to use that property, which they're not really entitled to do because it's not theirs. It's stolen property.
Right, but the question would be whether the state would be allowed to exclude them from that property, not whether they're allowed to give a property right over the public possession.
I think implicitly they would be, because if they're, I was thinking it's the equivalent would be like if somebody stole property from you and then they just sort of let somebody else steal it off them. I think that's worse than stealing something from you and then at least protecting it so that they can give it back. So I
Well,
think the only rightful thing for them to do is to give it back.
but like they wouldn't be like, let's say like some thief comes along and takes your watch. That thief wouldn't be allowed to prevent people from accessing it, right? Because they don't own it, and ownership is the right to prevent access.
Yeah, I mean that's it's kind of true.
And like we can take this to like some public possession, like a public park or whatever. Like the state, like I don't see how the state has a right to prevent anybody from accessing that because they don't own it. If they were allowed to prevent access, that would imply that they did in fact own it.
Well, I think true enough, but then you have to consider that they shouldn't even own it in the first place. It's originally just stolen from somebody as a taxpayer.
Well, I don't think they do own it. That's my point. And because they don't own it, they don't have a right to exclude people from it.
Yeah, but then does it not make it worse? I mean, like somebody stealing a car and then allowing their friends to drive it around. Is that not worse than them just stealing your car and keeping it in a garage?
I
And
mean,
then
well, it would
get it
depend
back?
entirely on the view of who owns it, right? Because who actually owns the public park there? I don't see if anybody owns it, unless it like used to belong to somebody, and then the state just came along and said, "No, this is public now." I don't see how anybody owns that park. I think it's completely unowned.
I wouldn't agree with that. I think that creates a huge problem if you say that, all state property, scare quotes, isn't owned at all, because it kind of creates a mechanism where you're getting your tax money stolen off you, and then it can be, well, just because it's uncertain exactly who owns it originally, I don't think that's really enough to say that no one owns it now.
But
It
like,
would
surely,
imply.
if
Sorry,
we
yeah, carry on.
if we look at the claims to it, right, I agree a taxpayer would probably have a greater claim to it than a non-taxpayer, right? But surely a homesteader would have a greater claim to it than the state.
I don't think so. I think that it creates the problem that, like, for example, if two thieves teamed up, one of them stole people's wallets, went over to the other one, dropped it on the floor in front of them, then the other thief could just say, "Oh, unhomesteaded property, I'll have that," and then
Well, no, I don't
there's
think that's analogous because it's the definite property of a single person. That's not like a public park where they just mixed in all the funds to build this thing, right? Because let's look at the chain of title transfer when it comes to building a public park. Well, it was just some virgin land at some point. Then the state stole money to pay some construction company to build the park. So that money wasn't the state's. So the state didn't actually transfer the title to the materials that were used to make the park. So really, the construction company owns it still because they still own those materials and they homesteaded that land. So they'd have a better claim. If they don't care about it anymore, then some homeless guy comes along and he starts homesteading it. I think he'd have a greater claim to it than the state for sure, because the state surely has to have the least claim over it.
yeah, they have no claim over it.
Hmm. And if they have no claim to it, then how could they justly exclude anybody from it?
I'm just thinking because if they don't exclude people from it, they're sharing that property with potentially the whole world, and is that not implicitly just as bad, if not worse? I mean, it depends. It really does. It seems to me like there isn't really a libertarian solution to the state's borders except just to abolish the state.
I mean, like, let's say the state doesn't exclude anybody from accessing the moon. Are they sharing the moon with everybody, or are they just not excluding people from it?
Well, yeah, they're not excluding people from it in that situation.
But why are they when they're not excluding people from something else that they don't own?
Because they do have effective control over other stuff. They don't over the moon, of course, but
And I'm saying they should relinquish that control and not exert control over who's allowed to access things.
yeah, it depends. It depends what we're talking about. Because if it's something that can be returned to taxpayers, I think it absolutely should be.
But like, obviously, if we can, the taxpayer would have a greater claim to it than some random person. But my point is that some random person would have a greater claim to it than the state.
True, but I think we're talking about the state, and as if we can kind of have some control over it. I think if I were to have control over the state, I would want it to return as best as it possibly can the taxpayers' property.
Sure, and if it's possible to return the property to taxpayers, I completely agree that that's the just thing to do. But the question of open versus closed borders is whether or not the state should be excluding people from these public possessions. Open borders isn't saying that trespassing is no longer a thing, so it's solely about public possessions here. So, but the state has no claim to those possessions, so they don't have a right to exclude people. So, if we're going to have where the state relinquishes their control, that's the open borders position.
I don't think. But do you not see what I'm saying with that if they do relinquish the control, they're implicitly allowing everybody potentially in the whole world
Sure,
to take it.
They might be allowing everybody, but that's why we need somebody to come along and homestead it. Start exerting, control over that property.
No, I see what you're saying. I mean, you're not wrong, but I was thinking about it constrained to if we only had control over border policy.
And
So
if we only have control over border policy, we should make that policy as libertarian as we possibly can. And,
Hmm.
restricting people's access, having the state exert control as if it's their property, I think that's not libertarian at all. So, what's the other option? Well, we could have open borders. And open borders is where the state is not exerting their control over that area. So, that is one more area where we slice the state away. That seems to be obviously libertarian to me.
So would that also get rid of police and border control, or is it just stopping? Is it just stopping people from crossing into the country? Because if there's still police, and those police stop people from homesteading it,
Well, they should also, we should also stop that. I agree.
yeah, that's the trouble. Because it gets in very quickly, just gets into conflict with other things. Where if you're only controlling border policy, you don't get to control the other things, and it just kind of, I don't think it creates more libertarianism always. It depends.
So are you getting at like a sort of order of operations argument here, where it's like, okay, right, we need to get rid of police before we get rid of border control, or we need to get rid of the welfare state before we get rid of border control, or we have to get rid of X before we get rid of Y.
I would say that. I would. I would. It's not necessarily what I'm saying right now, but I do agree that yeah, it's an order of operations.
Well, like to me, that's entirely gradualist, right? Because gradualism, it's most often stated as like, well, we need to do things slowly. We need to do things at the right pace. And if we do things too fast, then they'll never work. We need to do things nice and slow, nice and chill. Well,
Hmm.
gradualism comes in another form, and it's this order of operations type thing, where it's like, well, we're not doing things too slowly. We need to do things in the right order, and then we can get to liberty. But this is opposed to liberty on principle. It's opposed to victory on principle, because it would be a victory to have the state relinquish its control over borders. But the gradualist position that is most often taken up these days is opposed to that on principle, which is anti-liberty.
I wouldn't say that. I think it's more about avoiding very very obvious consequences to removing something like, for example, if you remove the police and you also have like the army stopping you from creating your own community police force or whatever, you don't destroy the state's monopoly on it. You just set supply to zero.
I'm I'm reminded of a passage from Murray Rothbard's essay on the duty of natural outlaws to shut up, where he's basically saying, well, this anarcho pragmatism can't work at all because, if you there are people who would be badly affected in the short run, if they're high time preference and they only care about the short run. If we just immediately get rid of the state, well, there might be all sorts of problems and they might lose out in the short run. And, they might be like, well, here, I know that there will be long term benefits for me, but I don't care about the long term. I only care about the here and now. And I'm going to lose out on all my, like, welfare and stuff like that. And he says further, if you can't convince those people to not be against the state, then you certainly can't convince those people who would be worse off in the long run, because those people certainly exist, the net beneficiaries of taxation. They
Hmm.
may well lose out in the long run if we had anarchy, right? Which is why we can't be making these arguments about, like, well, we have to be concerned about consequences. This is why he makes the point of, well, if there was a button in front of me where if I press it, the state just immediately disappears. I would press it so much that my finger would blister. And you've got to think like that if you want to be effective in libertarian strategy, and that's why.
Well, yeah, I get that, but it's very likely if you were to suddenly, get rid of the police and only the police, while there's still also a policy that stops the free market from actually replacing the police force, quite likely that people will think, oh well, we let those libertarians get rid of the police, and now look what happened. And
I mean, how are they enforce those policies to prevent free market police? So they have no police.
but I know, that's why I used the military stopping you to get myself out of that. But there's a lot of, I mean, the police is just the worst example of that. You could have, if we are talking about open borders, you could have laws saying you're not allowed to, not rent a flat or hire someone because they're an immigrant.
And the Libertarian is opposed to both that and border restrictions. We can't say, well,
Mm.
we need to have this one aggression to prevent these other aggressions that the state is doing. It's like, here's an analogy for that. Here's a reduction ad absurdum. Let's say there is this rapist. He's going around raping women, and you see him about to rape a woman, and you call the police on him. Then you think to yourself, just before you hit the final digit in calling the police, you think, wait a minute, if I call the police and that rapist is arrested, they're going to pen him into a cage with a bunch of other potential victims, tax evaders, drug criminals, quote unquote criminals, innocent people. He's going to be caged in with these people. He's going to be penned in with them. And he's going to commit many, many more rapes in prison. So I can't really do that because if I, stop this aggression, then more aggressions will happen. But it's like, you should still stop that rape, right? Whether other aggressions happen because of that, that's kind of beside the point, right? Unless we want to just let that rapist go free, where he has to only have like one woman a month and then he's got to like run out of town or whatever. I think we should absolutely stop him, even if the state would pen him in with other victims.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, I should maybe avoid rape reduction shows because I've just been unbanned.
I was I had a pretty controversial example I didn't use earlier, but anyway. So I mean, yeah, gradualism. You want to avoid gradualism, fair enough. It's more, for me. It just. I mean, you're stopping aggression, but I don't know if I don't know if you always are, because if you, the state always has borders. It's just a question of are they policing their borders. And I think the fact that they are in some way asserting those borders.
Well, like, here's the thing: if they're not policing those borders at all, what is the sense that they actually have those borders? Well, there'll be a line on the map still, The UN will still say, yep, that's where the border is, but I mean, who cares, right? Who cares what the fucking state says that line delineates? If they're not enforcing it at all, doesn't matter. I can fucking imagine a million lines on maps, and none of them matter to anybody because I'm not enforcing them. If I start enforcing them, suddenly they matter.
Yeah. But then it's not really. I mean, like the border of the UK, for example, isn't really like, all the beaches. There is a. I'd put the border much more around any piece of property the government claims for itself. So if you imagine like a country that's basically Ancapistan, but it has like free trains run by the state, people keep getting taxed to pay for them. And the border would then not really be on the sort of geographical outskirts of Ancapistan. It would actually just be at all the train stations along all the tracks.
But that's my point. That is the open borders position where we shrink the state's border from the actual geographic region that is on the map to just what they are controlling. We're making them control less. We're shrinking them back, right?
Right. Okay. Right. No. Yeah. That's fine by me. Yeah. Because I assumed open borders. I assumed it was just the police. The government stops enforcing wherever their borders are, rather than pushing them back like that. Yeah.
Well,
So
if we wanted to be, super consistent in open borders, an open borders advocate would have to say, well, they're also not allowed to enforce over this public park. They're not allowed to enforce over the Capitol building. They're not allowed to enforce in any of these places, right? And that's why the Libertarian is open borders. It's saying that the state doesn't have property rights, so they don't get to say where people can go.
But yeah. Well, yeah. As long as you're making that point clearly, yeah, that's fine.
Are we in agreement then?
I think we are. Yeah.
Hell yeah, it's always good.
Yeah. No, I think it was essentially misunderstanding.
Yeah, well, that's good. Hopefully we can have more of these in future. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, that was a lot quicker than I thought it would be.
Very short one.
I think, yeah, with the open borders issue, it does definitely pay to be a lot more exact about what
Mm.
exactly it's saying, because just open borders leaves a lot of room for people to.
And you know, I think people make this confusion a lot because they just hear like all these like lefty types saying, "Oh no, we need like fucking open borders for all the fucking gay Muslims." It's like no,
Yeah.
like because I saw somebody, I think it was Dave Smith on Twitter making a Redux show, where he was like, "Well, if you're supporting open borders, do you also support open borders for the Capitol rioters?" And then there was a bunch of responses where it's just the Chad yes face because it's like, well, yes, open borders also applies to the Capitol building, you know.
Mm.
And I feel like a lot of people just don't get that, and they vaguely have heard about Hoppa saying something about closed borders. And it's a shame. I need to get an actual like Hoppa guy on here, where I can properly go through why that argument's wrong as well. But yeah, it's great having you on, man.
No worries, no.
I need to get some real craze ball on next time so I can have like a monster like 3 hour debate.
Yeah. Fair enough, yeah.
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 Yeah. Do you have
Never done
anything to
anything
plug or
before.
anything?
No, just I'm on Twitter, Liberty Devnal, if
Yeah.
anyone's interested.
Yeah. See ya.
See you around. Bye.
That was a speedy one, eh?